This is Newsnight with Stan Grant.
It's 11 p.m. Australian Eastern Time, 2 p.m. in London, 9 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Well, Russia will soon host the Winter Olympics. Right at the same time, it is outlawing what it calls gay propaganda, something that human rights activists say is giving the green light to aggression. Thanks for joining us. Russia's President Vladimir Putin has gone a step further, banning demonstrations and rallies in the Olympic city of Sochi. It's aimed at stopping any gay pride movement at the Games. Well, not surprisingly, outraged activists have been calling on a boycott of the Olympics, once again putting the issue of sport and politics front and centre. Now, it's an old refrain that sport and politics don't mix, but as you will hear later in this program, the two have really been joined at the hip. Even the idea of the Olympic Games, the very pinnacle of sport, is built around fierce nationalism with medal tallies and anthems. Go back to Munich in 1936 and Hitler presided over the Games before sending the world to war. In 1980, Western countries pulled out of the 1980 Moscow Olympics after the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. The Tokyo Olympics announced the new post-war Japan. In 1988, Seoul held the Olympics and embraced democracy. And in 2008, Beijing's Games were a coming-out party for the world's new superpower. Well, sport can bring out the best and worst in human beings, and so it is for nations. Well, is this the face of China's organ trafficking epidemic? This 6-year-old boy has had his eyes gouged out, a hideous attack that has shocked people in China. His family found him after he went missing for several hours. He was covered in blood and his eyes were missing, the corneas were removed. And he's now asking his family why the sky is always dark. Well, local authorities have ruled out that he was a victim of organ trafficking, but so many questions remain unanswered.
When will you put out all your costings? You've got 200 of them out there you've said you've done. We need to see that.
Frankly, it's been chaos, and I reckon the circus has got to stop.
Well, the votes are in and the verdict was for Kevin Rudd at tonight's Sky News People's Forum, as both he and Tony Abbott faced questions from constituents in Sydney's west. Ban Ki-moon urges the deeply divided Security Council to unite and bring peace to Syria as Britain drafts a resolution authorising all necessary measures in the crisis. And 2 military cadets could be put behind bars after being found guilty over the 2011 Adfa Skype sex scandal. US President Obama has been criticised for drawing a red line around the use of chemical weapons. He is now under pressure to strike against Syria or risk looking indecisive and weak. But it is far from clear-cut, as we've heard. Russia and China oppose any action, while any attack could worsen already high levels of anti-American feeling in the Arab world. At the same time, there is still confusion about who may have used the chemical weapons, the Assad regime or the opposition rebels. Earlier I spoke to Scott Birchall, International Relations Analyst from Deakin University. Scott Birchall, thank you very much for joining us here on Newsnight. Do you think it was an overreach for President Obama in the first place to draw the red line in Syria, saying if they use chemical weapons, there would have to be a response?
Yes, I think he probably regrets saying that now, because he's being required to honour his pledge, and there's enormous pressure within the US political establishment for Obama to honour his words. And of course, if he doesn't honour them, his credibility looks tarnished considerably. So although I suspect he doesn't really want to have to respond, he's now under pressure to do so.
Do you think it was something that almost didn't need to be said? Of course, the use of chemical weapons and an escalation of that type would draw a response anyway. The moral argument would be overwhelming.
Well, that's true, although we now believe that at least 100,000 people have lost their lives in the conflict in Syria. So the first question I would ask is why the gassing of people is the issue which triggers a response from the West, whereas the 100,000 deaths prior to the last week's attack didn't elicit the same kind of response. And I'm not so sure that the people who lost their lives previously would wonder exactly why this is the case.